Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Kip Davis. I'm a biblical scholar and a specialist in early Judaism and the Dead Sea Scrolls. If you don't know me, most of my work on YouTube is about promoting good biblical scholarship, and a common way of doing so is through combating bad Christian apologetics and non-Christian apologetics. So a few weeks back, I did a live stream in which I responded to a video on the historicity and the morality of the Canaanite conquest as it's presented in the book of Joshua. So during the stream, I experienced a lot of issues with audio clipping, but because it's such an important subject, I wanted to ensure a proper, clear presentation of some of the really bad ideas contained within the video to which I was responding, and how we should understand these critical texts within the Hebrew Bible. So this entire lecture on the Canaanite conquest is a little over 2 hours. It's almost 2.5 hours. And as a result of the length of time it took to put it all together, I decided to split it into 2 parts. Now, if you're interested in seeing the whole video, including part 2, right away, you can get access to that right now over at my Patreon for as little as $4 a month. You get early access to all of my content over on patreon.com. So, the original video to which I responded was called The Conquest of Canaan, Genocide or Just. And it was put together by Gavin Ortlund, who is a pastor, a popular writer, and an apologist who runs the ministry Truth Unites. Gavin has a PhD from Fuller in historical theology, and he wrote his dissertation on the church father Anselm. In the video that he made, he called this the toughest objection to Christianity. That is, the morality of the conquest and whether or not we can trust the account within the book of Joshua as historical, as a clear representation of what really happened. So I would encourage you to watch his entire video, which I've linked in the description. But now let's get into my response to what he had to say about the conquest of Canaan. About the issue of biblical slavery. Gavin made this video about the conquest of Canaan. He made this effort to provide a relatively cogent response to objections from skeptics. This gets a lot of traction in the atheist community with regards to the Canaanite conquest and how this has a pretty dramatic impact on ideas about morality and the character of God from, a critical perspective, from a scholarly perspective. My interest, I don't care about any of those things. I've talked about this kind of stuff before, but my interest tends to be with regards to the historical, social information that we can glean from these texts and how we can locate them and where in the history of ancient Israel. So Gavin's video is about 1 hour and 15 minutes long. I do not have the time to go through the entire thing. This response on its own is going to end up being quite long. And I honestly am only going to be able to tackle half of Gavin's video. I'll just set this up right at the outset. In his video, he makes 2 main arguments. One of the things I love about Gavin's videos is how well organized they are and at how good he is at sticking to his outline and communicating the topic in this really nice systematic fashion. And this is no exception. He made this very nice presentation about the conquest of Canaan, through which he was communicating 2 primary points. So his 2 primary points about the conquest narratives in Joshua are, first of all, that this is an example of hyperbolic warfare rhetoric, and that these texts need to be read appropriately with this background in view. And then the second of his points is that the other side of this coin with regards to ethics, morality, and Christian apologetics is justice, the judgment of God, and the character of God as it pertains to the question of the Canaanites. And the argument being made in the second part is that the Canaanites were irredeemably evil and basically deserved eradication as a result, and that the conquest was an expression of God's justice and his goodness ultimately. So I just do not have the time to get into that second point, to get into the question of who the Canaanites were and what they were doing. I will say this much about Gavin's argument, and apologetic arguments in this direction tend to be very horribly flawed because they take an extremely selective view of the textual evidence with regards to who the Canaanites were, what they did. A lot of the sources tend to be late. They are problematic because they're polemical against the Canaanites. And this is no exception for the biblical texts themselves, right? We can't take the Bible's word for it with regards to who the Canaanites were and what they were doing, because the Bible is a programmatic text. It's agenda laden. It's propagandistic literature. And this is all stuff that I'll get into a little bit. But I will say that in my response to Gavin here, through the points that I'm about to make in what follows, I think this is enough to basically leave that last question hanging, bearing in mind that apologists, when they're tackling the literature, are not providing a balanced appraisal of it, and they're just wrong on several points with regards to the history, the archaeology, and the sociological and religious questions. So with that in view, I'm going to get started here. I'm going to dive into there's going to be a couple of moving parts here. I have the video that I'm going to show a selection of clips from. I'll be responding to those. I'll also have my own presentation slides to share. So I'm going to be bouncing back and forth between a couple of things. I hope it'll go smoothly. There might be some rocky sections. I'm hopeful that there are Christians, that there are Christian apologists who come out, who check out the stream, who consider what I have to say. We're just going to start here. I'm going to start the video. I will stop it periodically, and then we'll say a few things as we go.
The conquest of Canaan, described in the book of Joshua as one of the toughest objections that can be brought against Christianity. In my opinion, it may be the single toughest one.
I hope you caught what he said there, because I think this is fairly important that we get this out of the way. I appreciate that that Gavin said this at the beginning, and I think it's important for us to dwell on this a little bit. Gavin acknowledges the very difficult obstacle that what I would call texts of terror, these are the texts within the Bible which seem to grate against our moral sensibilities. He acknowledges this very difficult obstacle that these texts in the Bible presents for people of faith, and especially for those with a pre-commitment to the scriptures as a divine book. Now, as we move forward, I think this is really key, because this also provides the rationale for responses like this. Apologetics written about the conquest of Canaan only exist because people are beholden to this idea about the special status of the Bible and its importance and its significance. So right at the outset, it's really good that Gavin acknowledges this. He's acknowledging this as a bias and you know a place where his investigation begins.
I want to just start by acknowledging tough area, tough topic. And I know a lot of Christians who struggle with this. I've known Christians who, when they take a deeper look at this and kind of open their eyes to really look into it, they have this deep sense of fear and kind of an uneasiness, like, God, can I really trust you? You know, are you the God that I thought you were? Have I misunderstood you all along? Are you the person I thought you were when I surrendered my life to you? Those are terrible fears to be stabbing at your heart, these dark fears like this. And they contribute to people not only struggling with faith, but in some cases departing altogether from faith. And I understand the pain of that. But I think there are answers that I'm going to try to share in this video that can help people in this area, that really can change our perspective about it, I hope.
We need to talk about motives in terms of our evaluation of these texts or these issues when it comes to the Bible. Do we seek for a more palatable reading because of a theological pre-commitment, or should we seek to better understand the text within its cultural and literary context? How do we do this responsibly, ensuring that we're not projecting our own feelings into the text? Like, Gavin comes right out and says as much, right? He's concerned about this issue because he already has this existing pre-commitment to the text, and I appreciate that he's been straightforward about this. But as I move forward in this video, this is always going to be in the back of my mind here, right? Readings that are evidence-based, faithful to languages and to the broader cultural context through comparative literature, ensuring that we're not privileging readings and ideas of one text over others. Like, these are the hallmarks of conducting responsible historical research. Now, how does Gavin wade through all of that with this theological pre-commitment that he has started from at the outset?
And my goal is to try to help people feel a sense of assurance about the gospel, to feel a sense of assurance that God is real, God is trustworthy, your sins can be forgiven, there is real hope. You know, the gospel is a message of tremendous good news, and I want people to feel assured in that. That's really the goal of all my apologetics work.
This is his goal here, right? His motivation is to make people feel better about this gospel faith that they already have, or about the gospel faith that they're entertaining or exploring or looking into. How does this affect his abilities to clearly evaluate these texts? Right away, at the outset, this makes me suspicious of Gavin's motives. If he's reading the text through this agenda and through this specific theological lens, I'm now concerned about his emotional distance. Like, how is this going to affect the way he reads these texts? This is very important. And I'll just say it again. Like, I do really appreciate Gavin being straightforward about this, because this is not something that you're going to get from everyone. There's plenty of Christian apologists out there who are going to present their work as if it's a straightforward given, as if they're doing scholarship when they're actually just not. So this is all stuff to keep in view here as we continue with the video. At this point, Gavin is going to go on to talk about the importance of context, and in doing so, he offers this analogy. And honestly, like, this really took me off guard.
Imagine that you're watching Star Wars Episode 4, the original Star Wars movie, 1977-ish, but you don't watch the whole movie. All you watch is from the moment Luke Skywalker shoots the torpedoes and you see them going into the exhaust port of the Death Star, and you see Grand Moff Tarkin, you see the Death Star gunners pulling levers, you see rebel ships flying away, and then you see the Death Star explode. And then you stop watching at that point. So maybe you've watched a minute, less than a minute. If that's all you watch, that's going to give you one kind of impression. And you might basically be saying something like, why are they killing all these people? You know, if you watch the entire movie and you see that scene in context, you have a completely different perspective. It may not even occur to you to ask a question like that. That's the difference that context can make. That's what I hope this video will do for the Conquest of Canaan, situating it in relation to the entire biblical story.
This is a strange analogy to make, especially from an historical perspective. I hope everyone recognizes here, like, Star Wars is fiction, and Gavin is attempting to make an historical case for the conquest. Now, I would also argue, I will argue in this response, that the conquest narratives are also fiction, but they're promoting from a very narrow view of culture and history. So he's right about one thing. Like, if you're going to read particular parts of the biblical story within the biblical story and define what that is, uh, this becomes your overview and your lens for seeing the whole thing. But let's be clear here, like, the biblical story is a carefully crafted selective narrative. It's propaganda for one side of a much larger conversation. So in Gavin's analogy, if the galactic empire is the Canaanites and the rebels are the Israelite conquerors, then if I'm approaching this stuff as an historian, one of my first questions is going to be to ask about a rebel agenda and their telling of the story, and whether or not there is an imperial version or a counter narrative to this story that exists somewhere. And if there isn't, is this something that we can even reconstruct from what we've got? I would have questions about whether this propaganda narrative is an accurate depiction of both sides, or whether perhaps there is an apologetic for a stronger, more aggressive winners in this conflict to cast themselves as victims, or to exaggerate the strength and the depravity of their enemies. Do you see what I'm getting at here? This is how we do history. This is how we read ancient texts within a sociological framework. Now, I don't think this is an analogy that Gavin has thought through very carefully. Surely he knows that there is tons of subversive, expanded Star Wars universe content that has playfully explored some of these issues, right? I raised this question with my good friend Apologia when I was getting ready for this video, and he reminded me of all sorts of stuff that takes place within the Star Wars expanded universe, which explores ideas about the so-called imperial story, right? There's an episode he drew my attention to on the show Clerks that talked about plumbers on the Death Star, right? Literally pick any number of skits on Robot Chicken. Or my friend Pat Lowinger from Discovering Ancient History with Pat Lowinger reminded me of this really, really old show on YouTube called Troops. Do you guys remember this? This was like a parody on that old TV show Cops, except it was about stormtroopers, and it was hilarious. But the point here is that there's another side of this story, and that's what we're looking at when we look at the conquest narratives, and when we're looking at it in conversation with any number of other biblical texts. Because another one of the problems that we encounter here is the variety and the variability within the biblical text, something that that my friend Dan McClellan will repeat over and over again, is that the biblical text is not univocal. There's not a univocality to it. We construct that on top of it. What exists underneath is oftentimes it's in conversation. There are individual texts within the Bible that are in conversation with one another, but a lot of the time they're not saying the same thing, and they're actually in contravention to one another. So Gavin goes on in this video to give two arguments for what he wants to accomplish, and these are arguments about ancient warfare rhetoric and divine judgment. So he's going to start here talking about ancient warfare rhetoric.
So first, let's talk about warfare rhetoric in the ancient world. And basically what I want to emphasize here is that right at the beginning, this point is not an answer to the problem, okay? This point is simply a framing remark that helps us locate what the problem is that needs to be answered.
I appreciate Gavin saying this at the outset. However, one of the things that I worry about in entering into the larger conversation of this this topic is how much this framing can become misleading when the fuller sense of war hyperbole is clearly understood and is correctly applied. So I have a few questions that I want everyone to keep in mind as we move forward. Does this focus on hyperbole and warfare rhetoric, does this distract from the core issues of the text? Does it help to reveal what these texts are about? Does it reflect their intended meanings? And this idea about the intended meaning of the text is something that we are going to continuously come back to. Okay.
So here's my argument. The biblical descriptions of these military expeditions into Canaan involve ancient warfare rhetoric, which employed hyperbole or exaggeration for effect of various different kinds, so that if you interpret these passages accurately, it's not describing genocide or a wanton destruction of non-combatants, as commonly supposed.
We're going to ask, as we move forward here, whether or not this is even true. Are these texts, when they describe the atrocities of the Israelite combatants and the extent of the slaughter in Canaan, is this just warfare hyperbole that is not describing genocide or the wanton destruction of non-combatants? That's a claim. Is this a true claim? Or is this actually what these texts are doing? Do they help us in our understanding of what's actually going on? Now, if these texts are merely employing warfare rhetoric, another question that I have is, does this exempt the possibility that they can also be descriptions of genocide and wanton destruction of non-combatants? So the question I'm asking is, even if this is warfare hyperbole, does this in any way guarantee that they are not also descriptions of what we would consider genocide? And I think that's a very important point to make. Finally, are the conquest stories the same types of examples of warfare rhetoric? So what Gavin is going to get into here in the next few minutes, he's going to provide some examples from the broader ancient Near East of what he sees as hyperbolic language with regards to descriptions of warfare.
It's just like today, we use almost in any competitive context, there are these forms of sort of trash talking. In sports today, for example, we say things like, oh, we totally destroyed them. We mopped the floor with them. We annihilated them. We demolished them, etc. And what we mean is we won. We had a decisive victory. And that's the same in the ancient world with military conflicts. The language that sounds universal to us, like every man and woman, young and old, everything that breathes, is actually speaking about not all people literally, but it's talking about the formal military opposition, and it's just a way of describing a decisive victory.
I'm going to push back on this point because I think Gavin is missing one of the things that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about in this video is the very critical cultic context for these narratives and their contribution to what the authors are actually trying to communicate. First and foremost, for me as a reader, as a student of this literature, is to know what it's saying. Who's talking to me? What are they trying to tell me? So I want to know what these authors are attempting to communicate. So the argument Gavin is making doesn't really work in view of why the destruction is viewed as total. He says it's no different than how we commonly talk about our favorite sports teams or watching competitions and describing our opponents. He wiped the floor with them. He destroyed them. And honestly, it's a callous and a clumsy comparison, because what apologists like Gavin, who make this sort of argument, are missing all the time is the really, really critical cultic context for a lot of this type of language and these types of literature. I'm going to be coming back to this point that the description and the presentation of total destruction is very critical for the authors of these texts to make other points which are primary. So the first thing Gavin does, moving forward here, is he begins with a bunch of comparative examples of what he sees as warfare rhetoric from the ancient Near East. He takes these from a variety of inscriptions, and he's doing so to make this point that non-combatants were not targeted by the biblical warriors, by the warriors of Joshua as they appeared in the conquest stories. All right, let's see how he does with this, shall we?
So one of the decisive ways you can see this in terms of outside of the nation of Israel is the way other nations will brag like this about destroying Israel. Okay. Pharaoh Merneptah in the 13th century BC. This is a commonly referenced example. He has a famous monument where he's boasting about destroying all these nations. And he talks about Israel and says, Israel is no more, his seed is not. Of course, we know that's not literally true. There's not a literal destruction of all Israel. King Mesha of Moab, similar language to describe the Israelite city of Nebo on a monument that he built, where he basically says, I sent by night and fought against it from the break of dawn until noon, taking it and slaying all. 7,000 men, boys, women, girls, and maidservants, for I had devoted them to destruction. There's that word Harram. We'll return to that word a lot throughout this video.
Okay, I'm actually just going to stop there and come back to this slide. We're going to talk a little bit more about the Mesha inscription as we go on here. Now, one of the things in this translation where Mesha says that he slew 7,000 men, boys, women, girls, and maidservants, in the reading that I've done, I've become fairly convinced that the term that is often translated as maidservants there is probably better translated as pregnant women. But this is a really important text because this is really the best evidence that we have from outside the Bible about the actual ongoing practice of what Gavin has called Harram warfare, what I'm going to continue to talk about as Harram warfare. So let's just keep that in mind here as we continue.
Matthew Lynch, in his book Flood and Fury, notes that the context of this claim suggests that it's not true that everybody in Nebo was killed. And he points out that a few lines earlier, Mesha had also boasted, I have triumphed over him, that's Ahab, and over his house, while Israel hath perished forever.
So at this point, Gavin is making the qualification here that the intended usage of this term to describe widespread slaughter is to communicate the total annihilation of people, but says that this almost certainly did not happen because of the ways in which other routes of this nature are described, and in view of the fact that we know many of these people survive further. When we do talk a little bit about the Mesha inscription, I'll get into more about what's going on in this text and why I think we need to take more seriously this particular term. Harram is the verb. Harram warfare is the term that I'm going to use. This is something that is very specialized, and it needs to really be considered separately from the overall question of hyperbolic warfare rhetoric.
We're going to get to verses in Joshua where there's this language of they perished, we destroyed them, etc. The verb Harram is used. We'll talk about that. We have to remember these other passages that say the same thing about Israel. We destroyed Israel. There's so many examples of this. I'll just give a couple of representative examples. You can get into the literature on this yourself and see a lot more. So here's a couple. Ramses II, he's an Egyptian pharaoh. He's describing the Battle of Kadesh, which is a famous battle against the Hittites. Somebody should make a movie about this battle. Kind of a fascinating event. Listen to how Ramses describes it. I found the mass of chariots in whose midst I was scattering before my horses. Not one of them found his hand to fight. Their hearts failed in their bodies through fear of me. I slaughtered among them at my will. Not one looked behind him. Not one turned around. Whoever fell down did not rise.
I'm just going to point out here before moving on from this particular inscription from Ramses. He's not talking about the total annihilation of a people group or civilians. He has restricted this description to enemy warriors. Okay?
Elsewhere, he says, speaking about himself in the third person here, His Majesty slew the entire force of the foe from Kati, together with his great chiefs and all his brothers, as well as all the chiefs of all the countries that had come with him, their infantry and their chariotry falling on their faces one upon the other. So you get a sense of kind of how wars can be described. But this is an example of where, in this case, most scholars think that this battle resulted in a draw. Ramses was unable to capture Kadesh, though he killed a lot of Hittites. Nonetheless, you can see how people describe their military actions. Here's another example from Pharaoh Seti I. He's boasting about his northern wars, describing himself in the third person. He leaves not a limb, that is an heir, among them, and he that escapes his hand as a living captive is carried off to Egypt. Well, clearly, the carrying off of the captives shows that the first claim, leaving not a limb, is hyperbolic.
Does it actually, though? I mean, can't it both be true that Seti eliminated all the heirs of the Mitannis and then also carried off prisoners from the battle? Is Gavin conflating some things here, maybe inappropriately?
Another pharaoh, Tutmos III, or Tutmos the Great. He's a 15th century military leader. Some have called him the Napoleon of Egypt, and he's describing his military campaign against the Mitannians. He says, the numerous army of Mitanni was overthrown within the hour, annihilated totally, like those now not existent. But we know that the Mitannians lived on, and you can read about them fighting further into the 14th century. Here's one from a 10th century Assyrian king. He's describing a victory over the Aramaeans. I annihilated them. I scattered their substantial auxiliary troops, and I broke up their troop contingents. I captured those who attempted to escape. I caused their blood to flow like the waters of a river. Webb and Est note that just a few lines later, he admits.
So Webb and Est, that's William Webb and shoot, I can't remember his first name, but they wrote a book called Bloody, Brutal, and Barbaric. It's a Christian apologetics book about the Canaanite conquest, texts of terror in the Bible, problematic texts in the Bible. There are many problems with this book. I spent some time working through some of these on another channel some time ago. The Freed Thinker, my friend Tyler Vela, we did a stream together all about this. And if this is something you're interested in, I encourage you to go check that out at your leisure.
That several hundred enemy troops did escape. And so the language of I annihilated them, I captured all who attempted to escape is an exaggeration. I'll put up one example from Sennacherib, a later Assyrian king whom you may be familiar with from the Bible. And there's the phrase, no one escaped. So I'm just trying to give a little bit of a sampling. This gives you a little flavor. And this is not the only kind of hyperbole that's used in ancient warfare rhetoric, but the specific kind here, this is my own summary. I would say it's the language of totality in order to convey decisiveness. So people are saying we destroyed everybody, but what they're really meaning is we won decisively.
Gavin says there, it's the language of totality in order to convey decisiveness. That's warfare rhetoric. That's hyperbole. And the existence of that, the argument follows, as near as I can tell, the argument that follows from that is because this warfare rhetoric is used, because of this hyperbolic language of totality, we can then assume that non-combatants were not harmed in the conduction of this warfare? Is that the argument that's being made? I think that's a very, very problematic argument. Now, in all the examples that he showed, I would agree there is no question of the employment of hyperbole and its intention. Yes, it's intended to convey this sense of totality. It's an exaggeration intended to prop up and to emphasize the extent of the victory of the conqueror. But are these texts equitable comparative works to the conquest narratives? So every single one of the texts that Gavin drew from in his rehearsal of this type of language, importantly, these are royal inscriptions. So these are stelae, almost all of them, that are erected by conquering monarchs. They're erected to their gods and their communications of gratitude and thankfulness to the deity. That's not what's in the conquest narratives. The book of Joshua is presented as a recounting of the history of Israel, whether that's an accurate portrayal of what happened or not. We're going to get into that. This is what this literature is intended to be. So right away, there's a generic fallacy that's taking place here when we're looking at these royal inscriptions and the type of language that kings are using in describing their victories to the gods, and what the early writers of the Hebrew Bible are penning for their audiences. It makes a big difference here. I'll say it again. You'll notice in the Egyptian sources that he cited, in virtually all of them, the destruction on every single one of those texts is restricted to military engagement. They say nothing about contact with or the extent of destruction on non-combatants or civilians. I also think that's an important difference with regards to this question. And again, even though this is hyperbolic language, how certain can we be that there was not also immense slaughter? Does this preclude the death of non-combatants? When the Egyptian kings or the Assyrian kings talked about eliminating and annihilating their entire, all their enemies, wiping them out, if this is an exaggeration and some people did survive, does this mean that they did not engage with or commit atrocities against any and all civilians? This is the real problem with employing this argument of hyperbolic language as an apologetic tool, because you're creating this slippery slope whereby if you think that all the language, all the hyperbolic language of combat and destruction in the Bible suggests that these are purely military engagements and that no civilians were harmed in these military engagements, then this is also an argument that you must apply then to all these other texts that you're using to prop up your argument about the Bible. Do you see how this works? On the basis of this argument, we need to walk away saying, if this is Gavin and he's using this argument as a means to say civilians were not targeted or harmed in these biblical texts, and all this language to that effect is hyperbole, then he's got to agree that where every one of these inscriptions employs the same sort of language, then they also resulted from military engagements where no civilians were harmed. Now, how realistic is that? And how prepared do you think Gavin is to go that far in making this point about hyperbole? So from here, Gavin's going to move into talking about the very important biblical idea of Harram warfare. And I'm going to spend considerable time throughout this response talking about Harram warfare and why really this is such a problematic idea with regards to the apologetics that surrounds the conquest narratives.
So just to get into it a little bit, we've already seen this Hebrew word harem, often translated when it's a verb to totally destroy. And this can also be used in other ways. You can talk about something being given over to the Lord completely, like in the temple, for example. In Leviticus 27, this verb is used to describe a field or an animal that's been set apart to the Lord. But in the context of battle, it has a very particular meaning. Chris Wright refers to harem as that specific form of warfare in which Yahweh is the chief protagonist and the enemy is renounced or devoted to him.
This is an okay definition. I'm not going to quibble with it too much, but I'm going to point out here that in the apologetics that I've looked at with regards to this question, there is a frustrating lack of engagement with the idea of Harram as a cultic term. Gavin hinted at it a little bit when he talked about how this word can be used for notions of excommunication. It can mean to dedicate. It can mean forbidden. It can be used to declare something sacred. So this is the definition of the verb from which the noun harram is derived as it appears in the standard work. That's the Hebrew Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, or halot. You can see here that while it's got a relatively flexible usage, it's always restricted to these cultic and sacramental sorts of settings, which is really, really interesting when it comes to the hifal form of this verb. This is how it's used in descriptions of warfare, how it appears most prominently in the books of Deuteronomy and Joshua and through some other parts of the Deuteronomistic history. Halot says that it means to put under the ban, to devote to destruction, especially war booty or cities with all that is in them, all inhabitants, all male, the cattle. The intended meaning here has to do with dedicating something to Yahweh by the ban as a means to rule out the possibility of redemption. I've got some other notes here from a variety of other dictionaries that I'll just read to you. So this is from the New International Dictionary of Old Testament Theology and Exegesis. It says the verb is only used in the causative stem, that's the hifil. It appears 48 times, and the hofal, where it appears 3 times. It designates a special act of consecration. It involves consecration of something or someone as a permanent and definitive offering for the sanctuary or in war. The consecration of a city denotes also the total annihilation of a population in war. The utter destruction of the city or country in respect to foreign nations appears in 2 Kings 19:11, 2 Chronicles 20:23, Isaiah 11:15, and so on and so forth. And the emphasis is on the element of an action that is radical and total. The nominative form of the verb haram, which is haram, this is the noun, denotes an act of consecration, extermination, and killing. It involves the exclusion of an object from the use of abuse of humanity and its irrevocable surrender to God. Surrendering something to God meant devoting it to the service of God or putting it under utter destruction. So the nominative is reserved for things and cattle, and occasionally in these contexts, it also is used to refer to human beings. I'm going to read a little bit from the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament. The hifil of Harram belongs to the fixed framework of a generally constant narrative scheme found in the Deuteronomistic texts. It appears regularly in wars of conquest against enemy cities. The negative is implied when anyone survives and is delivered, and this is really, really key. Most often in descriptions of Harram, especially the expanded descriptions of Harram, the emphasis of the story is on the disastrous outcomes when people don't follow through entirely with it. So T. continues. The negative is applied when anyone survives or is delivered, is released, is shown mercy, is saved alive, or even is allowed to make a treaty or enter into marriage. The taking of booty can also apply the negative. Not as extensively, but still quite clear, we find Harram in the context of the sacred, in the sense of something being removed from the sphere of the profane and set apart for Yahweh. So the point here that I really want to make is that when talking about this idea of Harram warfare and these texts, which describe the total annihilation of people, it's really, really important to understand it in its cultic context. Harram is a sacred idea. I've described this in my course on ancient Israelite religions as a form of human sacrifice. It is a means of transferring the devoted property of Yahweh from this world into the divine realm. In order to do that within an economy of sacrifice, the way that you get things from the natural realm to the realm of the gods is by killing or destroying them. Harram is a sacred idea, and it's in keeping with this sacred context that we need to see what it means, how it works, and why the text describes it in the way it does. This is just the kind of stuff that you never hear from apologists when they're dealing with this question of Old Testament atrocities or of the annihilation of the Canaanites. Now, importantly, Harram warfare is something that actually happened, and based on the little bit that we do know, it was brutal and it was exhaustive. And what I mean by that is that the intention of Harram was always the total annihilation of whatever it was that was devoted to destruction, whatever it was that was the Harram offering. We're coming back to this very important text, the Misha Stele, because this is an example of this practice being carried out by not just an Israelite, but a Canaanite king, the king of Moab, Misha. And this took place in and around 835 BCE. The Misha Stele says, "And Chemosh said to me, go take Nebo from Israel. So I went by night and fought against it from the break of dawn until noon, taking it and slaying all 7,000 boys, women, girls, and pregnant women, for I had devoted them to destruction." That is the verb Harram for Ashur Chemosh, who was the divine consort that King Misha the Moabite worshipped. Then he says, I took from there and it's broken off, unfortunately, something of Yahweh, bringing them before Chemosh. I think this is probably the priesthood of Yahweh in Nebo. It's interesting that there is a priesthood of Yahweh, and there would have to be a temple of Yahweh there in Nebo in the 9th century. I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. I want to spend just a minute, though, dwelling on what's going on here. Misha says that he slaughtered everyone as a devotion to his god at Nebo, except for the priests. I'm going to say this is probably the priests, okay? Priests of Yahweh. He seems to have kept them back and taken with him to his place of worship, the Temple of Chemosh. When Gavin talked about the Misha Stele, he noted that scholars say that the slaughter at Nebo wasn't total. He says, we know it wasn't a complete annihilation because of the way that Misha also exaggerates his descriptions of his victories elsewhere on the Stele. Now, I don't know how good of an argument I think that is. We don't really know the extent to which Misha was successful in obliterating everyone at Nebo. What we do have are some 8th to 7th century BCE mentions of Nebo in Isaiah 15 verse 2, Jeremiah 48 verse 1 and verse 22, where the site is ascribed to Moab. So whether or not this meant Misha eliminated the entire populace and everyone that lived there, we can't say, but we do know that it's a city that Israel never managed to recover. This is from a book by Tracy Lemos, and she makes a really good point here about, this isn't the book, this is an article that she wrote recently about genocide in the biblical text. And she says this text, the Misha inscription, is useful for various reasons. One is that it provides a 9th century terminus antiquem for the development of a genocidal practice referred to as Harram, and for the development of extreme, even genocidal violence of a more general variety between Israelites and other groups. It might even strengthen the monarchic era dating of the biblical texts that attest to the same usage of the term Harram. Another important facet of this is that it demonstrates that genocidal violence occurred in the context of land disputes. Although more than one biblicist has attempted to minimize the severity of the genocidal passages of the Bible by stating that such violence did not really occur, the Mishnah inscription instead points one toward the conclusion that such violence did in fact sometimes happen. And the point she's making in her article is that these sorts of descriptions of total annihilation and violence using the term Harram are most often attached to land disputes, to the acquisition and the taking of massive tracts of territory and property from other people groups. So all this to say that Harram, we can be relatively confident, was a real thing, that it was really terrible and brutal. Within the sacred context of the idea of Harram warfare, the importance of it was the total destruction of whatever it was that the deity had set aside for the offering, for the ban. And in view of that, it's pretty difficult to argue from this specific term that this is just warfare hyperbole. I hope you can see the exceptional difference between just saying we wiped the floor with them as a means to say we defeated them, and saying this is my offering to my God that he is demanded. Just let that sink in for a minute. I hope everyone sees that critical difference. I'm going to go back to the video, and we are going to continue to talk about just how important this term, Harram, is in this discussion of biblical violence, genocide, and the conquest narratives.
In the Bible, what this really means is the connotations carried by Harram, complete destruction, are decisive victory with the result of a comprehensive overturning of power or a redirection of purpose. But it doesn't mean a universal loss of life. And I think this is just really impossible to deny if you work through the text carefully.
So I would argue that what Gavin is doing here is he's actually conflating the idea of Harram with the technical terminology. So while I would agree that many of the texts within the conquest narratives envision wars of total destruction, within this context, importantly, Harram is not always carried out. And here's one of the reasons. Here's one of the reasons I tend to push so hard on the importance of knowing the languages when conducting this kind of work is this. Like, you can read an English translation of the biblical text and see places where it says they were annihilated, they were totally destroyed, they were wiped out, they were exterminated, and these all sound like synonyms to you in English. But importantly, these are all different words in Hebrew, and some of these words, this one word in particular, Harram, carries with it such a specialized cultic, sacramental meaning that it cannot be just interchanged with these other words. It doesn't really have any other synonyms in the biblical text. What Gavin is doing is he's providing this false sense that these proscriptions, Harram warfare, belong to the same categories of hyperbolic warfare rhetoric described in these other ancient Near Eastern texts that he mentioned above. And it doesn't. I will go on to show more clearly what's going on with the Harram texts. But at this point, Gavin now takes a minute to talk about text in Deuteronomy 7. And he uses this as an argument based on the inconsistency in the text, which he thinks shows that the total destruction rhetoric appearing throughout the conquest narratives is all just totally hyperbolic. So let's see what he has to say here.
So starting with Deuteronomy 7, 1 through 2, this is an important early text. We have this commandment. The commandment is devote.
Importantly, when Gavin says early text, he means something quite different from what I mean when I say early text. I suspect that he probably means this was written by Moses, where I would say Deuteronomy is not especially early for one, and most likely the earliest parts of it, I would say, date to the late 7th century.
These people to complete destruction. This is talking about various of the Canaanites, and show no mercy to them. And then you'll find language a lot like this all throughout the narrative in Joshua, for example. And it sure sounds like, just in English translation on a first pass, it sure sounds like this is talking about, everybody dies, no survivors, right? But already right here out of the gate, the very next verse, if you just keep reading, there are these prohibitions against intermarriage. And this already just raises some questions.
You see what he's getting at here, right? Gavin says that within Deuteronomy 7, you've got this description of total destruction, annihilation, wipe them all out, don't let any of them live. And this is followed by the mention that you are not to intermarry with them. This raises for us a question. Like, what are these texts about? It's really, really important, I think, when exploring the ideas being forwarded by the text, that we have a clear understanding of what the texts are, what they're about. What are these stories? So there's two key things I want people to take away from this response to Gavin. The first is that the Canaanite conquest did not happen. The Canaanite conquest did not happen. Certainly it did not happen as described in the book of Joshua or even in the book of Judges. The second thing I want to communicate to people is the highly specialized nature of this idea of Harram warfare. And we're going to talk a lot more about that as we continue. So, the Canaanite conquest did not happen, and we know this from a fairly comprehensive appraisal of the archaeological record. What you see up on the screen is from a book by Israel Finkelstein and Amichai Mazar, two Israeli archaeologists who have both conducted excavations and written extensively about Israel in the Iron Age. This is a very basic short summary. There's literally thousands and thousands of pages written about the conquest narratives and their proper historical framing. So here's what Finkelstein and Mazar say in summary of the field. Since the 1960s, it has become obvious that this was not the historical reality. Archaeological investigations have shown that many of the sites mentioned in the conquest stories turned out to be uninhabited during the assumed time of the conquest, that is, around 1200 BCE. This is the case with Arad, Heshbon, Ai, and Yarmouth. At other sites, there was only a small and unimportant settlement at the time, as at Jericho and perhaps Hebron. Others, like Lachish and Hatzor, were indeed important Canaanite cities, yet they were not destroyed as part of the same military undertaking, since approximately 100 years separate the destruction of Hatzor in the mid-13th century BCE from that of Lachish in the mid-12th century BCE. At other sites, the archaeological evidence is even more meager. They continue. It is thus now accepted by all that archaeology in fact contradicts the biblical account of the Israelite conquest as a discrete historical event led by one leader. Most scholars of the last generation regard the conquest narratives as a literary work of a much later time designed to create a pan-Israelite national saga. Nonetheless, even this latter view does not exclude the possibility that certain conquest stories echo isolated individual historical events that may have occurred during the late 2nd millennium BCE, though perhaps not specifically in relation to Israel as a nation or to Joshua as a military leader. Other stories seem to be ideologies rooted in situations related to the period of the settlement. The stories and prescriptions for annihilation of foreigners, as in the book of Joshua, are set in context, I would say, of radical religious reform. Something like the Deuteronomistic reforms of Josiah in the 7th century. Incidentally, the name of the king is Yoshiyahu, which is not the same, but phonetically very similar to Yehoshua, the name of the leader of the conquest of Canaan. Tracy Lemos, read a bit from her article earlier, has argued that massive increases in population density in the 8th century resulted in land scarcity, and that this was comparable to the lead of the Rwandan conflict. And this is where she situates this type of literature. She says, we have then archaeological evidence population increases that in all likelihood decreased the amount of land available for most households. Textual evidence for land seizures by elites as resources became more scarce, what social scientists would call resource capture, and both archaeological and textual evidence for markedly increasing social stratification. All of this was occurring in Iron Age too, just as the rise of the Assyrians placed increasing pressures on small polities of the Levant. It would not be surprising for increasing population and decreasing resources to lead to tensions of various kinds and to competition between groups. And again, biblical texts and other evidence seem to apply amply to attest to this. The political situation created by the Assyrian destruction of the northern kingdom, it created this atmosphere of land shortage through which something like the conquest narratives could emerge. I tend to think another possible social location for these texts is in the Persian period. The Persian so-called Jews, the returnees from Babylon to the Levant, were immigrants coming back to the land and were promoting their own sense, their own agenda, their own propaganda about their legitimacy in this place. Take a look at Ezra chapter 9. This is verses 1 to 2. It says, the people of Israel, the priests and the Levites, have not withdrawn from the people of the lands by their abominations of the Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites, Ammonites, Moabites, Egyptians, and Amorites. For they have carried off from their daughters for themselves and their sons, and they have mixed up the holy seed with people from other lands. The hand of the leaders and the officials is first in this treachery. And this also fits with some of the prescriptions in Deuteronomy against intermarriage, right? This is part of the prayer that Ezra delivers to Yahweh as a result of this situation. He says, now what can we say, our God, after this? Since we have abandoned your commandments, which you delivered by the hand of your slaves, the prophets, saying, the land into which you are entering to possess is a land of contamination, because of the filth of the people of the lands by their abominations, by which they have filled it from end to end with their ritual uncleanness. This looks very similar to what we see being narrated in the conquest narratives. So, something else to say, especially as we move forward. In this model, we have two stories, two traditions. We have stories in Joshua of this military entrance into the land, this extermination of the population and the replacement by the people. We have an alternative version appearing in the book of Judges. And I would suggest, scholars suggest, that these are derived from competing traditions. Those which many scholars are ready to accept as more representative, that is in the book of Judges, or the early settlement and the emergence of the tribal confederacy. But the intent here is key. The lionization and the celebrations of total annihilation are also juxtaposed with warnings and promised consequences for the lack of total follow-through that reflect on extreme xenophobia in these other social contexts. So the proper way to read the conquest narratives is through this lens of these later social historical contexts where the people are working very hard to express their devotion to maybe a new form or a revitalized form of Yahwism through their separation from outsiders. This literature is all insider outsider polemic kind of stuff. We're going to get back to the video.
The legitimacy of this question of like, what does that really mean? Complete destruction, Harram warfare, ratchets up further when you go through Joshua and Judges, because over and over and over, you see that the people who are utterly destroyed or harramed keep popping up. They're still there in that same region. So looking through Joshua, the first 5 chapters of Joshua are kind of preparatory. The people are crossing over the Jordan River. Joshua is commissioned. There's the spying on the land. They're circumcised. There's the Passover. And then the key military offensives are in Joshua 6 through 11. This is that key textual unit. Joshua 12 summarizes all the kings that were destroyed. And then Joshua 13, to the end of the book, is describing the various allotments of how the land is divided up and so forth. It really sounds like they are successful in taking the land in those chapters. Later in the book, we read that not one of all their enemies withstood them. Okay, that's talking about these battles in Joshua 6 through 11. And at the end of this section, chapter 11 ends saying that Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses. And Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal allotments, and the land had rest from war. So it sounds like what God promised to the patriarchs, what God commanded through Moses, now has been executed through Joshua. Then you get through the list of defeated kings in chapter 12, and chapter 13 picks back up. You fast forwarded till where Joshua is older in life, and you see in verse 2, this is the land that yet remains. And in fact, in verse 1, it says there's very much land still to possess.
All right, so I want to pause here for a minute. What Gavin is arguing is that because there are what he sees as these inconsistent descriptions of places where certain enemies are totally annihilated, but then show up later, he says that this is just a clear indicator to us that all the language here is hyperbolic. We'll get into that, and I'll show why this isn't such a clean argument. Also, remember what I said about the different sources that we're dealing with here in terms of the biblical text. Just keep that in mind. So now he pulls up this one example here, and this is important. He talks about Joshua 13, 1-2, which talks about how all the regions of the Philistines still remain. Now, in Joshua 11, 21-22, we read this about the Philistines. It says, Joshua went at that time, and he cut down the Anakim from the mountain, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, from all the mountain of Judah and the mountain of Israel. With their cities, Joshua offered them up for Harram. No Anakim remained in the land of the sons of Israel. But then the text goes on to say, only those left were in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. This is the territory of the Philistines. So I reject this as an internal inconsistency in the book of Joshua. Joshua's victory was over the Anakim throughout the territory of Israel. Importantly, they did not defeat any of the Anakim who were in the Philistine cities, in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod.
And then what's interesting is it describes a lot of the regions that have already been harramed or totally destroyed.
Yes. He's going to get to some more of these examples, what he sees as clear examples of this inconsistency, but I'm just going to point this out again. Most of the time what he's dealing with are different sources. He's conflating these two traditions, this tradition of extermination in Joshua and this tradition of much slower conquest and expulsion that appears in the book of Judges. He's attempting to put them together, right? Well, no, this is not how this works. These are different traditions. So of course they're going to say different things about the places that were conquered. I'm just going to read some more here. So this is from Dozman's commentary on Joshua chapters 1 to 2. In the introduction, he says this: the books of Joshua and Judges agree in portraying the Israelites as non-indigenous to Canaan, requiring an invasion to secure residency in the land. But the nature of the invasion, the view of city-states, and the relationship between Israelites and the non-indigenous urban population of Canaan are significantly different in the two books. The book of Joshua does not share Judges' dark view of history, in which tradition inevitably leads to forgetting of the past, resulting in apostasy and the decline of culture. Instead, the story of Joshua traces the procession of the ark into the land with the positive goal of the Israelites resting within the land in covenant with Yahweh. The contrasting views of history in the two books are reinforced with different presentations of the most prominent characters. Joshua emerges as the central leader and the most dominant character in the book of Joshua, as compared to his less defined role in Judges. The Israelites are presented as a unified nation under Joshua in their conquest of Canaan rather than as individual tribes, as in Judges. The plot is also different in the two books. Judges is a story of conquest. Joshua is an account of extermination. He goes on to say, Joshua is a story about the successful purging of royal cities from the promised land of Canaan and the extermination of its indigenous population. The point of view of the two books provides a further contrast. Judges idealizes the southern tribe of Judah in telling the story of the conquest, while the book of Joshua focuses on the northern site of Shechem as the central sanctuary of the ark. The comparison indicates that the author of Joshua reinterprets the partial and failed conquest of Judges into an account of the successful extermination of the indigenous kings and royal cities under the leadership of the northern hero Joshua. This is from Butler's commentary on the book of Judges. Judges makes no pretense of organized warfare to capture the land. Rather, Judges shows a desperate defensive strategy to repel victorious intruders. Similarly, the enemies of Israel expand rather than contract when compared with Joshua. Instead of a comprehensive battle plan against native inhabitants, as in Joshua, in the book of Judges, Israel fights Mesopotamia, Moab, Philistia, the kings of Canaan and Chatzor, the Midianites, and Ammonites. This means the victories of Moses in East Jordan must be repeated, as must victory over the northern tribes centered in Chatzor. This here is from Susan Neidich's commentary on Judges. American and European biblical scholars in the 20th century expressed an understandable interest in matching the narratives of Joshua and Judges with actual historical origins of the Israelites in the land. The Bible itself seems to offer two versions, one represented in Joshua. For example, the summaries in Joshua 10:40-42, 11:23, 18:1, 24:8-13 suggests that Israelites swept into the land in an unbeatable military wave in which all enemies fell before Joshua and the Israelites, portrayed as a unified, successful commando force aided by the divine warrior and assorted miracles. The other version, well represented in the middle chapters of Joshua, for example, 13:1-7, 15:63, 16:10, and 17:12, and throughout Judges, offers a more halting and disjunctive portrayal of the Israelites' early presence in the land, describing successes and failures in establishing themselves. Judges includes both alternating periods of subjugation and of subjugating, and a more tribal accounting, as Israelite groups are seen in various geographic locations, north to south, living side by side with non-Israelite groups who have not been rooted out. The critical point here is that what Gavin is doing is he's comparing apples and oranges. He's looking at two separate accounts of the settlement and the conquest of the area, of the region. And he's combining these things. And this is what creates the inconsistency. I would actually argue that the presentation of the conquest as it appears in the book of Joshua is actually much more consistent than it reads in our present version, and certainly than it reads in conversation with the book of Judges. So yeah, I'm going to play another clip and then the fun begins. We're going to actually get into some of the text here, because one of my complaints about apologists when they enter this conversation of war atrocities or the conquest narratives is they don't actually read the texts. It's really bad, people.
Take the city of Hebron, for example. Back in Joshua 10, it says Joshua and all Israel went up from Eglon to Hebron, and they fought against it and captured or I think it's Hebron, sorry, and struck it with the edge of the sword and its kings and its towns and every person in it. He left none remaining. And as he had done to Eglon and devoted it to destruction and every person in it. There's the claim. Every person in Hebron, none remaining.
That's Joshua, right? That's one version
Every
of this
person
story.
is to the sword. Well, you just pick up in the book of Judges and verse 10, Judah went against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. And this is what, now you might say, oh, well, it was retaken. They took the land. This is what people try to say. They took the city, and then in a very short window of time, when Joshua dies, now it's been recaptured and they have to fight. So it's back and forth. People try to.
Or we could say the sensible thing that Joshua is one version of this story and Judges is entirely another version of the story, and they don't line up. That seems more likely
to see that. This starts to strain plausibility when it happens to the same over and over and over to all these different regions. This is the case with Jerusalem. This is the case with Deborah. So back in chapter 10, it says, verse 38, Joshua and all Israel with him turned back to Deborah and fought against it, and he captured it with its king and all its towns, and they struck them with the edge of the sword and devoted to destruction every person in it. He left none remaining, just as he had done to Hebron, and so forth. Well, up ahead in Judges 1, the same thing. They're having to fight against the inhabitants of Deborah. Again, it doesn't seem like there's no mention of it being recaptured or something like this.
Right. Again, because Joshua is telling one story and Judges is telling another story.
It happens over and over and over and over. It happens within the book of Joshua itself. Chapter 12 says that they defeated the Jebusites, but then you keep reading, and chapter 15 says they didn't defeat them fully, and they dwell there to this day. You keep reading in the historical books later in the Bible, and you see the Jebusites popping up during the reigns of David and Solomon.
So with regards to Jebus or Jerusalem, one of the things I think is really important to note is that this is one of the cities in the conquest story that is in Joshua that is not subject to the Harram. There is no Harram offering in the conflict with the Jebusites. This is a really important distinction, and I think this helps to alleviate some of what we see as an inconsistency as it appears in the book of Joshua.
Book of Joshua chapter 10 includes the Gaza territory as having all that breathes devoted to destruction. He left none remaining, but one chapter later, there's still people who are there.
In that text, one of the other difficult things when it comes to understanding these texts today is that some of the statements that are made with regards to the activities of the Israelites are specific and targeted to specific cities. But then there are a few places where these summary statements, which goes something like, Joshua, he swept through the hill country in the north and the south, and he committed everything to total annihilation and destruction. He offered everything up to Harram from as far as Carmel in the north to the Negev in the south. I just made that up, but it's very similar, these sorts of summary statements. And I think that's what's happening here. It appears to be kind of a geographical summation of the totality of destruction of the entire territory. But as we noted earlier, Gaza is part of the Philistine holdings. So none of Gath, Ashdod, and Gaza, the Philistine cities, appear to have been directly attacked or destroyed in the conquest narrative. Gath is mentioned as, sort of the boundary of the extent of Joshua's conquest activities in chapter 11. But I don't think we can take that to mean that the author intended to communicate that all of Gath was part of the Harram. What Gavin's going to do next is he's going to get into a really important text for understanding this idea of Harram warfare and for understanding what these texts are about. And that's a rather famous story in 1 Samuel chapter 15. This is the story about Saul and the Amalekites. And Gavin is actually going to make the claim that this is one of the strongest indicators of hyperbolic warfare rhetoric in the Bible. That's for next time. I'm Kip Davis. Thanks for watching.